So as we look at the questions, and in the interest of time, I won't ask for what people came up with. But question number one, in present-day Michigan, what Indian tribes or nations' traditional homelands were north of the Grand River and south of the Grand River? Why is it the Grand River? Because of different treaties, but also Westminster has land south of the Grand River and north of the Grand River. Okay, north is Camp Henry. South is this location. So north of the Grand River, the two Indian tribes are the Chippewa and the Ottawa. And south of the Grand River, the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. Okay, I see some nods, so some of you got that. So number two, what are the indigenous persons' names of their tribes and nations? So what we call the Chippewa, they call themselves the Ojibwa. O-J-I-B-W-E is one of the popular spellings. Also the Ottawa, spelled O-W-A-W-A. And then the Potawatomi is pronounced Potawatomi, B-O-D-E hyphen W-A-D-M-I. So these three nations are called the Council of the Three Fires, which is a long-standing Anishinaabe alliance formed in 796 at Michilimackinac. So those three nations have been affiliated with each other for quite some time. Okay, number three, the land north and south of the Grand River was ceded to the U.S. government. What's the name and date of each treaty? The land south of the Grand River, Treaty of Chicago, 29 August 1821. So that's like 2 years ago. It was the 100th anniversary. Okay. And then north of the Grand River was the Treaty of Washington, which is 28th of March 1836. So that's coming up in a few more years. These treaties were in many ways like boilerplate, the elements of the treaties. Also, it's often, in addition to designating the land, but how much annuity payments would be made to either individuals or to the nations. In addition to that, they provide in-kind support. So maybe monies for teachers, for schoolhouses, for books, agricultural implements, cattle, mechanics tools, vaccinations, as long as they were on the reservation. Tobacco, salt, fish, et cetera, et cetera. So these were often elements of the different treaties. Question 4. So what year did Michigan become a state? Anybody?
1837.
1837. How long after the Treaty of Washington was 1837? 1 year. So we first got to get the land, have legal possession, and then we can create a state. Number 5, what are the closest Indian reservations to Grand Rapids in King County? At the casino. The Isabella Indian Reservation in Mount Pleasant. Isabella County. Yeah, and there's a casino there. But Gun Lake doesn't have a reservation, even though there's a casino there. How many other Indian reservations are there in Michigan? Where? Their names, they're all in the UP. Anybody? Pardon me? Yes.
What?
Marcy, Bay Mills Indian Reservation, Sault Ste. Marie, Chippewa County. Bay Mills. Any other guesses for the remaining 3? Michigan Potawatomi Indian Reservation in Harris, which is in Menominee County. Ontonagon Indian Reservation in Ontonagon County. And L'Anse Indian Reservation in L'Anse and Borrega County. So, if I hadn't done this research, I probably would have gotten an F. Because this isn't stuff that's covered in my American, history classes and such, Tom?
Do you know what tribes are represented at Isabel?
Probably the Chippewa, because they're northern Michigan. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Great job on the questionnaire. I appreciate it when students want to stay engaged in the instruction. Yes, Dan?
Who represented the U.S. government and who represented the tribe?
Yes, good question. We'll touch on that in just a moment. I'm going to do somewhat of a chronology, but I need to first qualify. So I've been working on this now for a couple of months, and then I found out I have an hour. And we have a timekeeper who's going to keep me on task. I've got over 2 hours of content. So some people say, give Dan more time. But that's not possible. So I want to show hands. You can talk about the indigenous or the Indian, or talk about early Grand Rapids history. Those are the two halves. I can spend some time in each, but what do you want most of? Show of hands if you want the indigenous Indian history, the local Grand Rapids history. Pardon me? Yeah. And actually, a thought that I have is to do this presentation for the older adults. So you all can come with the older adults if I get on their schedule, and then we'll maybe do 2 sessions. Okay. So the mound builders, otherwise known as the Hopewell Indians, how did they get their name? One of the first burial mounds to be excavated was on the land of an Ohio farmer in southern Ohio, and his name was Hopewell. So archaeologists call the mound builders the Hopewells. The mound builders lived in the Grand River Valley over 2,000 years ago, near present-day Granville, so near the river. They're known, of course, for their large burial mounds. A group of the mounds remains in Grand Rapids today. They're called the Norton Group, and they're off of Market Avenue south into Indian Mounds Drive. And those are among the best preserved in the Great Lakes region. The Hopewell were driven out of Michigan by the Miskoting Indians, and they were exterminated by the Algonquin. They basically drove them to the water's edge and they all died, they all drowned. So just like the white man, we try to get possession of land through wars, the same for the Indians. So the Indian burial grounds. In 1874, the Kent Scientific Institute, which is a precursor of the Public Museum, they explored 8 groups or clusters containing a total of 46 mounds near the river, just below the south line of the city, which in 1874 was Hall Street. And what did they find? In addition to remains of human bodies, different relics, copper implements, which date a little bit when they were the burial, because when was copper available? Pottery jars, drinking vessels, silver trinkets, vases, turtle shell bowls, and effigy pipes were a variety of the things that people were buried with. It wasn't just the Egyptians that buried their people with stuff for the future journey. The Indians did it too. So the burial grounds at the Indian village below Pearl Street Bridge comprise a number of mounds which have since been defaced and leveled in the construction of streets. Yes. So this is Albert Baxter. He is and he's on the bibliography that you could pick up at the door. His book is the authoritative history of Grand Rapids. That's not the only time. I've heard, incidentally, when I-196 was being built along the river between Grand Rapids and Granville, The construction foreman told the workers, if you're excavating and you find human remains, don't say anything, because they'll make us stop. And we need to build a road. So these mounds up here by south of Bridge Street, I believe are called the Converse mounds, and then there's also the Norton mounds, which are down by south of Market.
Dan, do the local tribes still consider the mounds along Indian Mounds Drive to be sacred ground?
Yes.
And what has been done to help protect that from human incursion?
Yeah. So Ron Yob, who's going to be presenting here in the middle of October, he came to our Justice Committee a couple months ago. We spoke about that. He's open to giving tours, but it's sacred ground. It's burial. It's like us going to Arlington Cemetery and just running around the place. So it's got limited access. It's under the purview of the public museum. Yob has access. He's got a key to the padlock to open the gate. He takes groups of Grand Valley students there. Our own Kyle Quires has taken the students there. So yeah, it's still there and it's still honored by the local. But they don't want to make its location very public because they don't want it to be desecrated. So the Converse mounds, so this is a map of Grand Rapids, undated, west side of the river. Grand Valley is like in this area now, but the Converse Indian mounds were here. They're called Converse because it was the area replanted by a Mr. Converse. But then also there were two missions. There was one mission up here, the Baptist, one down here, the Roman Catholic, and there was a cemetery by the Roman Catholic mission. So that's by Geelot Place in Butterworth. That also no longer exists. I'm told that that land was turned over and made into cornfields.
Dan, what year was that map?
I don't have a date on this map, unfortunately. My guess is because it's platted and the street names are not the current street names. Lake Michigan Drive used to be called New York. Yeah. Yeah, so this is probably pre-1910, 1912. So the Algonquin Nation. So there's the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. The Ojibwa, they were the hunters and fisher-persons in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. The Ottawa in our neighborhood were fur traders. They traded fur, berries, maple sugar. And the Potawatomi worked the fields and grew crops south of the Kalamazoo River. So the Grand River Valley was occupied by the Ottawas. They had villages at a number of locations. One place is called Battle Point, which is a few miles upstream from Grand Haven. Crockery Creek, which you're probably familiar with. You see the water tower as you go to Muskegon. Crockery Creek, the Rapids, Grand Rapids, Plainfield, Ada, Lowell, and then other points upriver. They had villages. In the late 1600s, the Ottawa established a village here on the river named Owashtonong. Sippy means river. Owashtonong is what we call the Grand. So that means far away water, and it's because the Grand River is 252 miles long. Where are the headwaters of the Grand River?
Jackson.
That's right. I included this long visual here because of its source. The people of the Three Rivers wrote a book, and at the end of the introduction, note on indigenous prehistory. I think this is important for us Northern Europeans and how we organize and conceptualize information. And I'll quickly read through this. The existence of Native American populations in the Americas has always been of an interest to European and contemporary scholars. It should be clearly stated, however, the Native peoples do not always subscribe to the academic interpretations of their respective histories and beliefs. For centuries, scholars have been attempting to theoretically explain the origins of American Indians. In contrast, it should be remembered that Native peoples have formalized traditions which describe their existence in diverse regions. The American Indians explain their life and past as an act of creation rather than as a stage in evolutionary theory. All peoples have the undeniable right to spiritual interpretations of life and purpose. These beliefs are the very core of Native American societies and must be considered as viable alternatives to continuously changing scientific explanations. So there's a message of humility here until we look at how they organize and understand their history, their ancestors, and their life. In 1804, the first Europeans arrived, but they were either affiliated with a mission, and there were two of them in the valley, the Baptist mission and the Roman Catholic mission, or they were fur traders. In 1821, there were 50 to 60 Indian huts on the west side of the Grand River. That's where most of the Indians lived, not on the east side. Here's a map of Michigan, 1823. Yeah, it's not as we understand it today. But it identifies, of course, the rivers. And then over here, I don't know if you can see it, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Michilimackinac, Chippewa. So it identifies the major nations. While we have the screen up here, there's a line here. So this is the Grand River, and then it's called Indian Line. So in 1821, the land that was ceded to the U.S. government is all south, into northern Indiana and a little bit of Illinois. 1836, that treaty is the land north of this line up into the east. Okay. So a little bit of numbers. In 1867, there were 232 Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi statewide. There were 3,800 males, 4,100 females. The Indians organized themselves into 70 distinct bands. Each had its own chief. So to get to the question that Nick raised, who were the signatories of the treaties? The U.S. government would have one or two, but the Indians would have all their chiefs. They inhabited 179 frame and 821 log houses, erected over 2,000 homesteads, so they're very established. Personal property was valued at $376,000. I crunched the numbers thanks to Google. 10.7 million in today's dollars. And they were cultivating over 10,000 acres of land. And this is from the city directory in 1867. So very established, very prosperous. Here's a land of where the Ottawa villages were between 1812 and 1836. A couple up by Little Traverse Bay, Grand Traverse Bay, and along the Grand River, and the White River, Whitehall and Montague. So none of them are really inland. They're all on water. Water is the main route of transport. So they're mostly by the lake and by the rivers. Naming terminology. I mean, are they Indian? Are they American Indian? Are they Native? Are they Native American? Are they indigenous? Are they First Nations? What do people want to call themselves? That's where I started. So what do people want to call themselves? This past summer, went to Camp Henry. You'll hear more about this next week from Jake Jacobs. One of the presenters was asked this question by some of the youth campers, and he says, I prefer to call myself Indian because in the legal documents with the U.S. government, they always say Indian. So he says, by using Indian, I have legal standing. Okay. He said, indigenous sounds like another word, ignorant. So he said that's not too keen in his community to use indigenous. I'm moving myself from this to this, based on what I heard at Camp Henry. So the treaties between the U.S. government and the nations. 1821, Treaty of Chicago, south of the Grand River. So that's this land that we're on, 47 Jefferson. 1836, Treaty of Washington, north of the Grand River, Kimball Lake, New County. This was a very disturbing statistic. Of the 370 U.S. government, Congress ratified Indian treaties, none were completely fulfilled by the U.S. government. None. So all those elements identified earlier, they'd get payouts and they'd get tobacco or salt or whatever, teachers, instruction, schools. There was at least one element in each of those treaties, each of those 370, that we reneged on. So, when I'm trying to develop a relationship with someone who's Indian, I gotta remember the history. Why should they trust? Why should they trust Dan? Why should they trust Westminster? Based on that history. And that's in the book by Jackson. It's on the table back there. It's called Century of Dishonor. And it looks at 100 years of treaties and how they played out. So the Indians, what were some of their values or beliefs? Well, religious beliefs of the Ottawa centered about the natural world, the universal supernatural power which shaped it, and their relationship to its forms and forces. Ottawa beliefs define the acceptable ways to interact with the elements of their world. And worship was not separated from daily life. Sounds very similar to our Calvinistic tradition. Everywhere the Ottawa went, and each task they performed required an understanding of a realm beyond their physical surroundings. Every element in the Ottawa world, from the rocks and the trees to the animals and other human beings, was made up of two basic parts, the body and the manatee, or the spirit. The wise person, the wise Indian person here, took no chances and tried to treat all beings in the land, living or otherwise, as though they were kin. So there's a deep respect for animals. There's a deep respect for plants, a deep respect for the earth and for the water. The Ottawa used the resources around them and in return offered songs, prayers, and other gifts to perpetuate their close relationship with the spirit beings. Like if there was a hunt, they would basically have a ceremony before they go out to kill. And then when they kill the animal, they give deep thanks to the animal spirit for giving them sustenance. And the author here, the people of the three fires. So these are the Ottawa, the Ojibwa, and the Potawatomi, who were authors of that book, sharing their values and beliefs. Early Indian and European life. So the government built for the Indians a mill on the creek. So Friday I was at the public library in Marcy trying to figure out where is the mill on the creek, and they found me a map. Bless their hearts, those people are wonderful. We're across the D&M Railroad. What's the D&M Railroad? Detroit and Milwaukee. I thought, you got a lake in between. But anyway, there's a railroad called the D&M Railroad. So I found it's Coldbrook by Coit. Anyway, the Indians had a village of 20 to 30 houses, built of lumber sawed by the mill. In 1837, all the ground spoken of above was cultivated, planted with corn, which the women well hoed. The men fished and hunted. They lived up and down the river and throughout the country as ever before. And every fall, they assembled at Grand Rapids to receive pay for their lands. So that's the annuities per tree. Okay. So a thriving economy.
Over here, Dan. Somebody's trying to get you.
12 noon? Okay, great. So all beyond these Indian and white men's clearings was this huge forest as before the civilized man had entered upon the lands. In this valley they lived in peace and mostly There were in those times confidence and kindness between the different races, but there were some wrongs, more often committed by the whites than the Indians. Okay. So the two missions, they were competing actually with each other. On the west side of the Grand River, which was Indian land before 1836, and the 36 treaty, then that changed. So there's the Baptist or the Thomas mission south of Bridge Street. Isaac McCoy was their minister. The Roman Catholic or St. Mary's mission south of Fulton, Father Frederick Baraga. And that's by Deelock and Butterworth, which is where those burial grounds were, which were turned over and made into a cornfield. So, has anything much changed? So some kind of fight between the Baptists and the Catholics over what should happen to the land after the Indians left the village. There's been an Indian presence there for many years, as there were Indian mounds, which I believe are the Converse mounds, located where Phoenix Furniture would be until about 10 years ago when Grand Valley State University moved in and took over. Yeah. And here is a 1930s, a map that was handwritten by Kevin Finney in 07, showing the Grand River. So here's the rapids, the islands. This is Colebrook coming in. This is Plaster Creek coming in here. This is interesting. This is Prospect Hill. I'll talk about this in just a minute. But this is where Louis Campaw had his trading post and his house. So he was right near Island 1. And the Thomas Mission is here, which is just south of Pearl. And then the St. Mary's Mission here is over by Fulton. This whole area was clear. Indians were farming there, planting corn, and then you get above into the woods. And that's where the land kind of raises up, like the backside of John Hall Zoo, how it goes up. And it shows the Indian trails.
So then, the St. Mary's Mission.
Yeah.
I'm not good at really directions and things, but there's a St. Mary's Church.
Yes.
Was that part of that?
So
It's on that side of the river.
So yeah, St. Mary's Mission is not St. Mary's Cathedral. Our neighbors a short distance from here, but they moved to the east side of the river. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The same organization. Right along, another map from a different view. Here again it shows Prospect Hill, the islands in the river. It basically talks about vegetation. The rapids before the dams went in, it's like a mile long. 18-foot drop, top to bottom. So, now we're into Grand Rapids history, and I'll pick up the pace here, because we're going to keep on the time. So Louis Campaw, who you may have all heard of, got his birth and death dates. He was French, from a family of fur traders in the Detroit area. There is a Campaw Park in Detroit. Anyway, he moved west to the Grand River Valley, set up a trading post and a blacksmith shop between Pearl and Bridge in 1826. He traded furs with the Indians for metals and textile goods. In 1831, for $90, he purchased in plotted land the entire current downtown business district, 72 acres. $1.25 an acre. I think I have that in my pocket. And then I got the streets that mark the area. And then, so that was in 31. 7 years later, he established the village of Grand Rapids. Interesting, the French, when they would plant their street grid, they would follow natural terrain. So the river and Indian trails and bluffs, they would work with the natural terrain. And then he's buried in St. Andrew's Cemetery, right over here on Madison and Prince Street, along with other family members. And here's a map showing his plat. So Fulton, Division, Pearl. So you see how the streets are oriented to the river. Okay. And then his competitor, Lucius Lyon. His birth and death dates, he was English. Okay. So in 1836, he established the village of Kent. So we have the village of Grand Rapids and the village of Kent next to each other. The village of Kent was named in honor of a New York State jurist, James Kent. He was a rival of Camphaw. Their two villages did not connect, much to the annoyance of their fellow citizens. So see how the streets come through and they stop. Come through and they stop. This barrier, this fence of properties was put in by Lyon. No, by Campbell. Can you help me on this one, Marcy? It was put in by somebody. They didn't want the streets to go through. They really wanted to cordon off their areas. And so note where the two grids come together and the downtown forms a kind of pie-shaped block between Pearl, Division, and West Fulton. And you always kind of wonder, why is these streets so crazy? Well, you can thank Lucius and Louis. Let's see. Now that's a good overview. You see the grids and how the pie shapes, especially this block is really wild.
Wasn't Lyon a surveyor?
Yes. Yeah. A lot of these personages held a number of positions of either governmental authority, political authority. They would start banks and mills. So they were very involved in a lot of enterprises. And of course, he's buried in Detroit. This is a plat map showing of Lyon, pretty much north. So Michigan Street all the way up to Coldbrook. The Coldbrook Creek comes into the Grand there. I just want to point out while we're looking at this map, here's a canal. So here's the river, here's the land, here's a canal. It's 51 feet wide, and it was used to divert water so that they could power businesses along the river, and also that commerce on the river could bypass the rapids. Yeah. And this is an older picture showing again Reed's Lake in East Grand Rapids, Fisk Lake. Coldbrook Creek is subterranean most of the way, and then it empties into the river. Interesting, Lake Drive used to be called Clinton Road. So I get a chuckle, back when Clinton and the Blue Giraffes and going south on Clinton. Sorry. That's my dark humor. So trade in Ottawa means to trade. So the Indians traded furs, berries, maple sugar for different goods, ammunition, and whiskey. Beans and whiskey were legal tender. During the busy season, the Indians would camp about the swamps, pick the berries, and deliver them to Grand Rapids. Maple sugar also brought by the rapids, brought by the river to the rapids. During the spring, the river was alive with all this commerce. Fur prices. Well, if you're ever wondering what could you get for a mink. So in 1820, fur trading was big business. Furs commanded different prices. So beaver, mink, smokeskin, it was buckskin, marten, lynx, muskrat. Wolf and bear were not of much value. And as fashions did not change much, the above prices continued for years. Such sharp competition for the fur trade that traders would not wait for the Indians to bring their products to them. They would go out into the field. They'd send messengers with goods, the dry goods, the ammunition, the whiskey, if you will, to the camps. And then late in the fall, the Indians would separate, each family would come into the camp for hunting and trapping during the winter months. Interesting note here, the Indians liked that the French would give them credit for goods. So even before they had the furs, they could get provisions and they would have credit until the fall when they would bring the furs. But when the British fought the French, the Indians supported the French because the British would not extend credit. Follow the dollar. So the islands in the Grand River has 5 islands, north to south, number 1 to 5. Island number 1 or island number 2, depending on your documented source, housed the county jail. In 1872, our own Alcatraz, if you will. Although we didn't have sharks in the salt water. The rapids were 1 mile long, 300 yards wide, 18-foot fall. Interesting, with the water tumbling over the limestone edges, you could hear that over 1 mile away. Wouldn't that be neat now if you went downtown and you could hear the water? Then the rapids were submerged after the dams were built, starting in 1835. The fish ladder was installed in 1974. So that's 50 years next year. So Grand Rapids incorporated as a village in 1838, and then it became a city in 1850. I've got the population numbers, you can see the growth was steady, and then the boundary areas also increased. So in 1850, when it became a city, so East Street, which is now called Eastern Avenue, was the east boundary, Wealthy Street to the south, Straight Street on the west, and Leonard Street on the north. That's the original city. Okay, Prospect Hill. I pointed that out on the map earlier. So Prospect Hill was a bluff to the east of the river that was leveled. All the dirt was used as fill between the east bank of the Grand River and the islands. Okay, so that was all filled in with soil from Prospect Hill. So where the Amway Grand is now, and the building's about a half mile south and a mile north, all sit on the soil in Prospect Hill.
Prospect Hill is essentially where the water's building is it not?
Yes, it's in that area, exactly.
What was that comment?
Prospect Hill was where the Waters building approximately is. It's not where Prospect Street is. That kind of threw me for a bit, but yeah, it's closer to the river. And the Grand River Canal, so before 32 until 52, there was this 81-foot wide, 5-foot deep canal from Coldbrook to Lyon. Had a wing dam on the north end, so it would route the water from the middle of the river into the canal. It powered 3 sawmills, 2 grist mills, and some minor works. And even today, there's some residuals because there's Canal Park, and there's a 6th Street Park by the 6th Street Bridge. So Canal Park is where the canal was. I'm just going to quickly go over this, but the streets down by the river needed a lot of improvements because in the winter, in the spring rains, thank you, Gordon, they would flood. They would just turn into mud and muck. So they had to raise some streets as much as 15 feet, and they had to grade down other streets also. And this is some of the detail of that. Yeah. Baxter talks about it here. This class of improvements kept the city busy for upwards of 35 years from their beginning, and the end is not yet. So, talk about a public works project. Yeah. Fulton Street Cemetery, the oldest current cemetery in the city. The first burial date was in 1838. 25-year-old was the brother of William Haldane, who was the founder of the Grand Rapids furniture manufacturing industry. Other people that are buried in Fulton Street Cemetery are John Ball and his wife Mary Webster Ball, Joel Gill, and many Civil War soldiers. If I'm out biking and I come to a cemetery, I have to stop. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in the cemeteries. Here's the pamphlet from 1845 listing different services in Grand Rapids, trying to get people to move here. We have 7 churches and 8 resident ministers. So we probably had itinerant ministers, but we had 8 resident ministers. So Veterans Park, what's now Veterans Park, just a short distance north of us here, was first a public square, full city block, public square, and later became where the county courthouse was, which burned to the ground in '44 and was since rebuilt. Interesting here, at least on one occasion, the courthouse square was the site where the federal annuity payments based on treaties would be made to the Indians. So the Indians would come to Grand Rapids, they would camp along the river, and then on the appointed day and time, they would come up, and then they would get their payments. And of course, there's the granite pillars. We honor those from World War I, also World War II, Korean War, Vietnam conflict. And in 1957, the name changed from Fulton Park to Veterans Memorial. Bridges connecting the east and west. So Bridge Street was the first, hence its name. At first was free, and then later had a toll. Interesting. The toll, 1 cent for pedestrian, 2 cents for a person on a horse, 3 cents for a 1-horse vehicle, and 4 cents for a 2-horse vehicle. But the bane of the toll keeper was the toll keeper's on the west side. The east side young people would stroll from their side of the bridge to within a few feet of the toll gate and then go back. I mean, yeah, it's a good way to entertain yourself as a kid, you know. The Leonard Street Bridge was built in 1853. At first it was free, then it had a toll. Pearl Street, built 58, also had a toll. That's when they were built by private companies, and then later the city acquired them. American galoshes, I'll just quickly go over here. The Dutch guy, he comes here, they didn't have any wooden shoes, so he built a factory, turning out 12,000 pair a year. And it was very practical, remember, because the streets were muddy, and remember in the spring, and the snow melted and all that. And so when the streets turned into muck, having a pair of wooden shoes was really the solution. And the leather shoes would get wet, and then they would rot out. Bicycle craze, some of you know I'm an avid bicyclist. So back in the late 1890s, took the nation by storm. Grand Rapids had 6 bicycle manufacturing companies who reported 30,000 bikes made in a year. 2 years later, sorry, typo. The companies were gone, victims of age of corporate monopolies and business trusts. Factoid at the bottom, how many of you knew that the county road commissions were first created from pressure from the cycling community for better roads? Okay, yeah. So, the airplane with the Wright brothers and roads, you know, biking, you know, you can kind of in this business for something. And there's a photo of the local Grand Rapids cycle team. Oops. Where are we? So the Grand Rapids neighborhoods, there's a map that's coming up. But anyway, so Division and Lyon is where Westminster first had its meeting sites. And then back in the late 1840s, that neighborhood was called the Brickyard Dutch. And then in 47 Jefferson, in the 1850s, this area had the Hartside Dutch. I don't know why we keep affiliating with all these Dutch stories. So, Westminster Presbyterian locations, 1862 to 65, we rented the Sweetsborgen Church Building, northwest corner Division and Lyon. Some of you, Carol might know this. Carolyn, over the years, the Sweetsborgen Church rented their building to many organizations to help with their cash flow. So, Second Congregational, Westminster, Christian Reformed Church, Free Will Baptist, and the Disciples. All were tenants. And then in 1866, we purchased land at the opposite corner of that intersection. And then in 75, had to sell to the US government for the new federal building. And then since 1875 to present, we are here for 148 years. So here's a thing from Heart and Soul, which is a book about the ethnic neighborhoods of Grand Rapids. And it identifies the different neighborhoods. So the Brickyard is probably in this area. And then 6 is also where we are. So yeah, the Brickyard Dutch. So this is an interesting photograph. This is the federal building. This is the Swedish Morgan Church. So this is where we first met. Division and Lion, I think. Am I close, Carolyn? Division and Lion. So if you go down Division, of course, we're now back in this area. And there's a picture of Westminster Presbyterian Church. I came across this on Friday evening at the library. I love this library. Anyway, now I want to find out what was in this house.
It was a funeral.
That was the funeral.
I think so.
Okay.
And the chapel's on the far right, and that's what we worshiped in for 10 years
Yeah.
before we could afford the west side.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is not the dated photo.
I think I have it somewhere in my computer.
Okay, good. And then here's some other photos, streetscape photos of this area. So this is Washington and State Street from Jefferson. So if you're in our parking lot, right out this door, and you look this way and this way, this is what you'll see. Look at the trees. Just great vegetation, a very stately area. And this is Jefferson looking south from East Fulton. So here's the street sign. See the trolley tracks? One of those buildings are there today. East Fulton from Jefferson Avenue. This may be of interest of some of the people on staff who are clergy. Statistical summary of the churches, so it identifies how many buildings. The Swedish Morgan had 1 church, but if you look at the Presbyterian, they had 4. Gives you the number of congregants, etc., etc. So it'll give you a sense of the different denominations and their presence here in the city. Moving on Camp Henry, how are we doing now on time? We got 1 or 2 minutes? Okay. So Camp Henry, for 4 years, I was making contacts and trying to research if Lake Kimball had an Indian name. Couldn't come up with it. Made a number of contacts. Went to their library, went to the Historical Society, talked to people who lived there. And Lake Kimball was a field manager for the Ryerson and Hill Company based out of Muskegon. And so they would harvest the timber, float it down the Muskegon River to their mill. Interesting note, Martin Ryerson Jr., the son of this guy, was the benefactor of the Grand Rapids Public Library in 1904. So in August, just last month, I came across this site. I got an address I need to check out with the federal government to see if they know of a Indian name for the Kimball, because I'd like to give that to Jake Jacobs. And with that, I should probably end it. We're not going to talk about beer and street trivia. I'm not going to talk about street trivia.
We can make some of those now. We can make some.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And a lot of the credit goes to Deanna, who helped me with the techie part of this over the last half a week.
We're always grateful for the historians in our midst, Marcy and Dan and Carolyn, who help us remember the history. So why did we start here today, right? It's to get a glimpse of how much things have changed, and to have in our hearts and minds that not too long ago, right, we can imagine the trees, we can imagine, you know, that list of furs that were traded, haven't seen a minx around, just right, even the nature and the animals that were around. So I encourage you this week to, you know, pause and think about that a little bit. We're going to send out some stuff this week from our denomination about thinking about indigenous Indian relationships. We can talk more about the names and such. And, you know, even drive around and be a little curious. And when you come to faith formation, since the end of church waffles a little bit, our kind of time is 11:15 to 12:15 with a hard stop at 12:30. So we promise not to go over that, and that gives our people who come with 2 hours of information an extra little wiggle room. So anyway, so thanks for coming. Next week, Jake's going to be here. It's a really fascinating story of what's happened with the Native Circle, starting wondering about the cabin names, and they said, well, what we really care about is ... Come next week to hear the ... So blessings, go in peace, and grateful for all of those who have been on this land and in this place before us. Amen.